So, in this episode, I'll be talking about large data volume. So, one part of large data volume I wanted to talk about is to design your data model. Now, it's very important that before you build any solution on a Salesforce platform, it's important that you plan your data model because it's one of because when you look at the data, right, data is one of the important key element of any application, right? So user constantly create data and the data can grow, and over the course of time, you might realize that the application performances have gone sluggish, though you may not have recognized that when you were initially building it. So that's why it's very important to make sure that you as a data architect often get involved in building a right data model so that the whatever customization you're building, whatever solution you're building, cater for the future requirement. Now, the large data volume can be a problematic if you don't do this because usually you won't notice any performance issue when you're dealing with a small data volume, right? So you can often get by designing poor data model. But when it comes to large data volume, what happens is your application performance can become sluggish. This could be because of the slow queries, slow search, and list view become very slow. And even it goes to sandbox refreshing. What might happen is that your sandbox refreshing may become very slow. So now, what happens, right? Usually, from a Salesforce perspective, why do we often talk too much about designing your data model? What's the significance, right? This is to avoid something called data skew. Data skew is a very important concept. Uh, you might hear this term a lot when you're designing your data strategy or data model, the data skew. Now, data skew happens when you have more than 10,000 child record associated with the same parent in an org. So, for instance, I have an account, right? Now, account contacts are related to accounts, right? Say you can relate a contact to an account. Imagine you got a lot of unassigned contacts, right? So and you don't know where to put them. So what do you normally do? You link it to a generic account. So when that's fine when you're dealing with few, 100 contacts, but if it exceeds more than 10,000, then there is a high possibility that you've hit the data skew mark and your application will start to act a bit funny in terms of performance. And like I said, the queries will kind of tend to slow down. Now, data skew is a very generic term in Salesforce ecosystem, and we need to nail down to some few core terminologies. The most common data skew we often encounter is the account data skew. Um, Now, reason why I wanted to cover this because you will get asked these things in this certification, as well as you might experience something similar in your real life implementation when you're going to implement a project, right? So it's very important from that perspective you understand it. Now, account skew, like I said, right? I give an example of this specific account and a lot of contacts linking to it. So this may happen when it comes to migrating from Salesforce, sorry, from a third-party system to Salesforce. What happens usually? Implementation consultants get tempted when they have no account, sorry, when they have no relevant uh, account associated with the contact. So they often create this unassigned account and then link all of these contacts. Like I said, it's not a problem when you have a few hundred contacts linking to the same account, but it might hit the limit, right? And may propagate the data skew when it crosses 10,000. So now, why do you even talk about it, right? What does it even matter? Okay, you must be thinking, okay, so what is data skew, right? Why are we even talking about it? Okay, you explained to me that accounts should not be linked, sorry, one single account should not be linked to more than 10,000 contacts. But what happens if you do that, right? So there are two possible problems with that. One is the record locking, and another one is the sharing. Okay, now let me record locking and the sharing issue, right? Now, okay, now let's look at the record locking first, and then we look at the sharing issue. Okay. Now, in the record locking, what happens is that let's take the same example, right? Multiple contacts associated with the account. Let's assume that you're updating the large number of contacts, as you can see here, under the same account in a multiple threads, right? Now, what will happen, right? Different threads, right? If you wanted to update few and another few in a separate threads, for each update, your system logs both the contact being changed and the parent account to maintain the integrity. So let's say if you wanted to update, let's say, these contacts and different contacts and then multiple thread. So when the system try to update, let's say this contact, so it will lock these contacts as well as the account associated with it. So what that will do is that let's assume that another thread trying to do the same, right? So obviously it can lock the contact, but when it tries to locking an account, which is already been locked by a different thread, it will fail, right? So, and that's a big risk, right? An update can fail because the previous contact in this case is still holding onto that account and the account is locked. So this is one big issue. So you need to factor that. And then we have something called sharing issue, right? This boy here. Now, sharing can come into question depending upon how your sharing is configured, right? It's all depends on how your sharing is set up. When you do something that seems simple, like for instance, changing the owner of an account, okay, which is pretty normal thing to do, right? You may need to examine every one of the child account records, and you need to adjust the sharing as well. So what that will do, you might have to include something called recalculating the role hierarchy and the sharing rules. And it's okay if you're dealing with a few hundred child records, but if you're dealing with, say, thousands of child records, it can consume lots and lots of time, right? So that's one of the reasons why you got to be very careful when it comes to data strategy in terms of data modeling, right? Because Salesforce emphasize that you design your data model in an efficient way. And I kind of struggle at times when I see a data architect struggle to build a right data model because maybe it's a lack of understanding or whatever the reason being, but that's not really a great way to proceed in terms of solution architecture when you are trying to design a data model. Okay, so now we have something called ownership skew, right? This is, you might have heard about it. If not, you're in for luck, right? Because you're going to learn what an ownership skew is about. So, ownership skew, right, happens when a large number of records with the same object type are owned by a single user. Obviously, you know that, right? Every record is required to have an owner in Salesforce, right? So it seems like a pretty simple solution to assign a generic owner when you are not sure about that, right? Now, when that happens, you are causing an imbalance and causing an ownership skew, right? And now, what does it even mean, right? Okay, ownership skew. What does it even mean? What's the implication if, let's say, it happens? Well, it can cause performance issues due to sharing calculation required to manage the visibility of these records, right? So, like I said, I explained the sharing, right? How it's going to take longer to do thousands of child records. So, similarly, it can cause a performance issue in this case as well. Now, it is also one of the thing you need to understand that in some case, ownership skew simply cannot be avoided. In this case, there might be scenario when you can't avoid it. So in those scenarios, it's best to ensure that skewed owner, right, uh, does not have a role. So it might, because if you assign a role, right, to an owner, it will cause a performance issue. Now, at times you cannot avoid an ownership skew for whatever reason, right? So make sure that skewed owner does not have a role. Okay. So this way you take the user and the records away from the role hierarchy and its associated sharing. So just remember that. Okay. Now, there's another interesting one, which is you might have heard about it. That's called lookup skew, right? Right. Now, lookup skew happens when a large number of records are associated with a single record in a lookup object. Yeah, basically the object you're trying to search or the object you're searching against. That's pretty much in a nutshell. Now, you can place, right, lookup field on any object in Salesforce. There's no restriction. So lookup skew can create a problem pretty much for every object in your org, right? So it might seem like a very simple problem, but it can affect pretty much every object in a Salesforce because you can create a lookup field on pretty much any object, right? So what happens if you end up with a lookup skew, right? And especially imagine when you have a very highly complicated customization. I've seen org, especially the place I work, right? Especially place where I do consulting as an architect. Some of the orgs have such a horrible lookup skew, right? I mean, it's just it's not great architecture in any ways, right? Um, Now you must be wondering why it's a problem, right? I mean, I understand the ownership skew is a problem, account skew is a problem. Now, why lookup skew, right? After all, it's just a lookup object, right? Now, think about this, right? Lookup fields in Salesforce are generally a foreign key relationship between an object, right? It's like so lookup relationship is like a foreign key relationship. Every time when you insert or update a record, Salesforce must lock the target records, which are selected for each lookup field. And this is to ensure that the data integrity is maintained, right? Because that's a fail-safe way to ensured by Salesforce your data integrity is maintained. Now, under normal circumstances, right, when you're dealing with a very tiny data volume, you won't see much problem. But when you add a large data volume, right, you might hit lock exceptions, uh, which might like a record locking exception, right? And which will impact your insert or update operation. Um, so now this is very tricky one because at times you can't really identify it because there are no tools. Finding this can be like finding this issue, especially from an architect perspective, right? Like for instance, if you are given a, I mean to say there might be a third party tool, but what I was saying was there's no out of box tool where you can really identify. Maybe Salesforce might bring that up in the future. Whether you can identify, okay, we got this much lookup skews and all kind of stuff, right? Now you can build custom, but do you really want it to go that route? That's up to you, right? Um, so it's often good to have a data architecture pattern. Often when I go and consult, right, any work or any organization, especially from a Salesforce side, I often ask them, can you share with me your data architecture pattern, integration pattern, and identity pattern? Um, because it's very important to understand the kind of identity they use and have they used the right ways, or are they using old, or they're still sticking to old username and password. It's very important that from an architecture perspective, you ask these kind of questions, right? And when you ask these kind of questions, right, you will fairly get an understanding once you look at the data pattern or data model pattern, whether there is a lookup skew problem or, for that matter, any data skew issues that's happening in the org. Um, so that's one way you can like I've seen some of the org, right, which is pretty horribly written, built. It's an old one, and a lot of customization. The data model hasn't been given any much uh, hasn't been given much consideration when they're building it. Right, people were coming and going, and they're trying their own stuff. Right, so it's a kind of spaghetti mess, which is not really great, right, from a business perspective, because obviously business is losing a lot of money when you implement a solution in the wrong way. Okay, now there's two things I wanted to talk about: external objects, right? Because obviously we are talking about large data volume. Now, why do we need to talk about external objects? The reason why we wanted to talk about external objects because in terms of large data volume, right, it's not necessary that you have to bring every data to Salesforce, or in other words, you don't have to persist every data, though there might be a requirement to do that, but in most of the circumstances, you don't have to for certain things like old invoice data or for that matter, old order data kind of stuff, right? You can persist somewhere else and you can have the view to see that in the Salesforce. You don't really need to bring those old, like 10 years old invoices to Salesforce. It will hit the org capacity in terms of the data storage, and which will cost you more money. So you got to factor that. You should not be using Salesforce as your data storage mechanism, right? You can use Amazon S3, or you can use other third-party solution like Own Backup or other stuff, whatever, right? Um, okay, now external objects, right? And external objects you can leverage if you don't want it to store the large data volume into the org. Instead, you can use the external object. Now, external objects are not different than custom objects, except they map the data that's stored outside your Salesforce org. Could be anywhere, and so it's pretty easy, right? In that now, external objects, you must be wondering, okay, so when it comes to external object, right? Like we have normal custom object. Can you do a lookup, right? Yes, we can do a lookup, right? Now, that there are two kinds of lookup. One is the regular lookup where the parent objects are obviously the standard or custom object. Now we have something called external lookup. Let me write it down, right? So it's become easier. External lookup. Now, because why I'm talking about lookups, because we are talking about external objects, right? Indirect lookup. Now it's pretty simple, right? The people often get confused, right? The only thing I like in normal lookup, right? You're often dealing a lookup with a parent object, right? Which could be standard or custom. But in case of external lookup, right? Your parent object is always an external object, right? And your internal objects are or you can say the child objects, right? Obviously, you have a parent, you have a child, right? That's how the lookup relationships form. So the parent will always be external object, and an internal sort of child object will be your standard customer, or could be external. Now, when you're talking about indirect lookup, your child object will be an external object, and your allowed parent object will be the standard or custom, right? So it's pretty simple. In internal, your child object will be external, right? In external, your parent will be uh, external, but though you can include in external as your external lookup as a child object too. So this is what I wanted to cover, as a starting point, because obviously we are talking about the large data volume, and it's a very important topic from an exam perspective, also from an architecture perspective, right? Think about it, something like you wanted to implement in your organization. You might have a problem in your organization, how you can address it. So this is one way you can address it, right? So that's all I wanted to cover in this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode and hope this is informative. So thank you.